The millionaire CEO entered the wrong room on a cruise ship and was shocked to see the woman he once loved with two identical twin children. But before we dive into the full story, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is now. Subscribe to the channel and let's get started. Sophie stood in the bustling cruise terminal with her heart beating in her ears. Her hands felt clammy as she clutched 3 tickets and guided her 7-year-old twin boys through the crowd. She had spent the past year scrimping and saving for this trip, determined to create the kind of memory that might make up for all the questions about their father she could never quite answer. Overhead, the intercom announced departure times, and the twins, their sandy blonde heads swiveling in every direction, couldn't contain their excitement. "There it is, Mom!" cried one of them, pointing through the glass wall at the immense white cruise ship anchored in the harbor. His brother stood on tiptoe and let out a cheer. Sophie forced away the lingering anxiety and replaced it with a determined smile. Inside, the ship was even more impressive. Gleaming floors, soaring ceilings, and vibrant decor surrounded them. Sophie guided the boys through the reception area, following the signs for passenger cabins. The children pointed at every shimmering detail, from chandeliers to oversized porthole windows, while Sophie's heart fluttered at the thought of how much it must have cost to build a floating palace like this. In a dilemma, turning away from the pool to rummage in her bag for sunscreen, she never lifted her head to see who had just passed. A cool ocean breeze flowed over the deck as evening approached, and Sophie decided to take the boys to the buffet. She figured filling their bellies with something hearty would help them sleep well after such an exciting day. They found an open table among the crowd, the aroma of various cuisines drifted through the air, and the twins' eyes lit up at the sight of trays loaded with food. Ethan walked toward one another, the gentle hum of the ship's engines in the background. A staff member rolled a cart of linens between them, forcing each to move aside. The moment passed in an instant, and neither looked up. Ethan continued down the corridor, phone buzzing. Sophie glanced at her watch, anxious to return to the twins. They got within a few steps of each other, still wrapped up in their own worlds, then kept going in opposite directions without a second glance. The air around them felt charged. Ethan sat with a cup of coffee going cold in front of him. His mind raced as he scanned an early morning email about the changed schedule for tonight's meeting. His key business partners were docking at the next port, and he was supposed to finalize some major points. A wave of frustration washed over him. It felt like every plan he made got shuffled at the last minute. He glanced at his watch and realized he'd better grab something to eat if he didn't want a rumbling stomach interrupting the meeting. In their bright swim trunks, Sophie found a lounger and settled in to watch them, making sure they stayed within arm's length of the shallow end. There was a bar nearby serving tropical drinks, and she thought about grabbing a fruit smoothie. Just as she worked up the courage to walk over and order one, a tall man in a crisp shirt strolled up to the bar, phone pressed to his ear, frustration lining his face. For a split second, Sophie glimpsed his profile, and her chest constricted. That jaw, that posture, though a part of him was on guard, sensing a major shift he couldn't quite articulate. The afternoon wore on, and both Sophie and Ethan ended up on the top deck around sunset, drawn by the promise of fiery oranges and pinks streaking the sky. Sophie leaned on the railing with the twins, pointing at seabirds swooping low. Ethan stood on a different part of the same railing, phone in hand, talking in hushed tones about the final details for the meeting. Neither noticed the other's presence. The ocean corridor behind him hummed with the distant sounds of air conditioning and the faint murmur of late-night conversations. He was sure this was the correct cabin for the informal business discussion his assistant had arranged. The lights inside were dim, but he stepped forward anyway, expecting to find his colleagues wrapped up in negotiations or reviewing documents. Instead, the first thing he noticed was a pair of small sneakers lying by the entrance, children's sneakers. That was odd. This was supposed to be the wrong room. Her voice trembled slightly, belying her words. Ethan stood motionless, fumbling for something to say. He recalled every excuse or explanation he'd prepared for his business partners, but none of that applied now. This was Sophie, the woman he'd vanished from years ago, leaving behind a swirl of unspoken promises. And here she was, with two blonde boys who looked startlingly like a younger version of himself. The gravity of the situation dawned on him in a dizzying rush. His chest constricted, eyeing Ethan's expensive attire and Sophie's trembling frustration. "Is everything all right here?" he asked, arms folded over his chest. "Sophie V." Sophie crossed her arms, inhaling sharply. "We're fine. This passenger came to the wrong room, that's all." Ethan nodded, still somewhat dazed. "Yes, completely my fault." The guard gave them both a skeptical look, but Sophie's fierce expression dissuaded him from prying further. "Very well, ma'am," he said politely, then turned to Ethan. "Sir, let's keep noise levels down. Other families." His mind was consumed by the image of those two small boys and how much they looked like him at that age. Back in his own suite, he locked the door and collapsed into a chair, burying his face in his hands. Memories of Sophie, the warmth of her laughter, and the promise he'd once made to return, all crashed over him. He hadn't kept that promise, and now she might never forgive him. He took a shuddering breath, recalling how the twin who'd woken up stared at him with the same curious brown eyes. Sophie woke with a pounding headache. She'd slept in fitful bursts, replaying Ethan's stunned expression when he saw her children. Part of her wanted to believe he'd been genuinely unaware of her pregnancy, but another part was still furious, convinced that his ambition had always overshadowed his feelings for her. Pushing her tangled hair aside, she rose and checked on the twins, who were already awake and chattering about breakfast. Their youthful energy offered no room for her lingering sorrows. "Mom, can we—" Memories washed over her the night Ethan announced he'd be leaving for a short-term opportunity, the tears she held back when he promised he'd return soon, and the mixture of heartbreak and anger when weeks turned into months without so much as a call. She never wanted to feel that helpless again. Now, seeing him stand there, looking as unsettled as she'd ever seen him, reopened wounds she thought had scarred over. By midday, the sun was bright above the ship's top deck. Crowds gathered near the pool. "I don't know if I want them to be yours at all. You lost that claim when you walked away from me." He exhaled, shoulders slumping. "I understand you're angry. You have every right to be. But you can't expect me to vanish again now that I know. I can't just pretend none of this happened." Sophie's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. "Don't you dare. Don't you dare start talking about fatherly responsibilities when you've been absent for 7 years. The boys don't know you, and they're perfectly happy." She tried to push the memory aside. Ethan's sudden reappearance, the words they'd exchanged, the undeniable look of guilt in his eyes. Her priority was to keep life as normal as possible for her 7-year-old twins. They needed a vacation without dark clouds looming overhead. She forced a cheerful expression and roused the boys, helping them get ready to see the ship's activities for the day. "Mom, can we go back to the water slide?" one twin asked, bouncing on his toes as soon as he was dressed. Ethan wanted to fix this, but he also had to be cautious. For now, he decided to sit on the opposite side of the buffet, giving her space. Meanwhile, one of Sophie's twins began to complain of a mild earache. Concern flashed across Sophie's face. She quickly cleared their plates and brought them to the ship's medical office just to be safe. The doctor examined the boy and reassured Sophie it was nothing serious, likely just a bit of pressure from the change in altitude and the sea breeze. Still, she decided to keep them away from the deep end. She found a couple of lounge chairs and watched them from the edge, feeling a slight sense of ease as she saw them squeal and splash without a care in the world. It was a small reminder of why she'd chosen this trip in the first place, to bring joy to her children. While the boys played, whispers continued around the pool area. Sophie could sense eyes on them and overheard mutters like, "He has to be the dad," or "The resemblance is uncanny." Each word felt like a thorn jabbing at her. Deciding it was safer to stay put, she kept the door locked, focusing on a bedtime story for the twins. Her stomach twisted with anxiety over how quickly rumors can escalate. Around, she took the boys for one last walk near the deck. The moonlit ocean was calmer now, and many passengers had retired to bars or lounges. It was in this quieter moment that Sophie thought she could finally breathe without worry, just a mother with her children, enjoying the rolling waves, away from the world's prying eyes. But the ship's energy had changed. At breakfast, murmurs followed Sophie everywhere. A few bold passengers snapped pictures from their phones, pretending to focus on something else. Sophie lowered her gaze, steering the twins through the crowded buffet line, wishing she could shield them with an invisibility cloak. "Mom," one boy whispered, tugging her sleeve, "why are people looking at us like that?" She pressed her lips together. "They're just curious," she answered softly. Her voice dripped with bitterness. He winced. "I'm not here to talk about the deal. I'm here to figure out how to stop this from hurting you and the kids." Sophie's gaze flicked to where her sons were standing, huddled close. "If you want to help, then convince everyone to leave us alone, or just get off the ship, vanish into the wind again like you did before." Ethan clenched his jaw. "I can't leave. You know why." She shook her head, eyes burning. "I'm done talking, Ethan. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to keep—" That night in the corridor outside her cabin, Sophie ran into Ethan again. He looked pale, as if the day's events had squeezed every ounce of calm out of him. "I heard you're planning to leave," he said, voice tight. "Please let's talk this through." Her frustration boiled over. "You just want to salvage your reputation," she snapped. "You'll say or do anything to keep your business partners happy. Well, I'm not letting my boys become pawns for your image." Ethan's eyes narrowed, although sadness tinged them. She wouldn't allow her regret to weaken her resolve. This was the only way to protect them from the swirling rumors and the painful presence of Ethan. She ushered the boys through the corridor, their rolling suitcase bumping along the plush carpet. The ship's announcement system crackled, informing passengers that they would dock soon. Sophie clutched a small stack of papers, her request for early disembarkation signed by the ship's administration, plus some proof of identification the port authorities required. She opened her mouth to send him away, but all she managed was a tense exhale. Her sick child moaned, drawing her attention back to the exam table. "What happened?" Ethan asked, voice low, stepping closer. His face looked stricken with worry. Sophie's expression was rigid, though tears threatened to fall. "He got sick right when we were about to leave," she whispered, stroking her son's hair. "He's burning up." Ethan set down the folder he had been carrying and moved closer, ignoring Sophie's guarded stance. The small group headed out of the infirmary. Sophie carried a slip of paper with the medical instructions, and Ethan held the door. Her other son hovered between them, glancing from one adult to the other, as if gauging whether it was finally safe to relax. In the quiet corridor, they all seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. No paparazzi, no stares, just the lingering hush of midday on a giant ship. The boy who had fallen ill appeared much better, though still a bit pale. She wanted to be sure he was cleared for any activities and free of lingering fever. Her other son hovered near his brother, relieved to see him looking more alert. They made their way through the corridor, and Sophie kept a protective arm around the recovering twin. Yesterday's turmoil still weighed heavily on her, but she pushed the worry aside to focus on her child's health. They entered the ship's infirmary, where years she'd raised them alone, anger that the rumors had overshadowed the vacation she'd scrimped and saved for, and a guilty hint of relief that Ethan was finally stepping up, if only for a short time. She couldn't decide which feeling was stronger. As the meal unfolded, Ethan's phone buzzed on the table. He flipped it over, ignoring the call. Then it buzzed again, lighting up with a short series of urgent messages. He exhaled, an unspoken apology in his expression, and stepped away for a moment. Sophie was grateful for this temporary calm. Ethan took the twins aside to point out a flock of seagulls diving toward the waves, talking with them in a low voice. They stared, fascinated, occasionally bursting into laughter when a bird snagged a fish. Sophie watched from a few steps away, her heart caught in a mixture of yearning and guardedness. Soon, one of the ship's entertainment staff approached with a bright smile, handing out flyers for a kids' water activity, a small obstacle course in the shallow end. Sophie nodded her thanks to Ethan, acknowledging his effort, though she kept her expression guarded. He nodded back, water trickling off his pant legs. Before she could speak, Ethan's phone buzzed again. He quickly silenced it, but not before Sophie glimpsed the name of his top investor flashing on the screen. She sighed, turning to guide the boys away. The brief moment of harmony was overshadowed by the realization that Ethan's world of business demands never really went away. The steady hum of the ship's engine seemed louder than usual, like a low chorus to her restless thoughts. Even though the twins slept peacefully in the bunks, Sophie couldn't find any semblance of calm. For their sake, she forced a breath and tried to regain control. A soft knock broke the stillness. She opened the door a crack to find Ethan standing there. He looked tense and conflicted, as though he'd spent the last hour debating whether to come. "I saw the article," he said quietly, stepping in, "so we can stop the speculation." She scoffed softly. "You think you can control the media that much?" "No," he admitted, "but it's better than letting them run rampant with their own conclusions." Sophie pressed her lips together. She hated the idea of any statement, but hated the current chaos even more. "Fine, do what you have to. I won't attend." She tried to close the door, but Ethan gently stopped it. "I'm truly sorry," he whispered. "I never wanted any of this. I just want to do right by you and them." A moment later, the rumors had grown invasive and hurtful to the family involved. A flicker of annoyance passed through the group of reporters, as if they braced for a typical denial, but Ethan continued in a firm, measured tone. "I want to make it clear that there is a strong possibility these children are mine. Although I've only recently learned of their existence, I take full responsibility for my past mistakes." He paused, swallowing, and Sophie could see the tension in his shoulders. "Until paternity is confirmed." Damage control. Sophie felt her stomach clench at the question. This was her exact fear, that Ethan was only stepping forward to preserve his reputation. She could see from his tense expression that he recognized the weight of his next words. He locked eyes with the reporter. "I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do," he replied, voice calm. "Yes, I'm also negotiating a significant business partnership, but my priorities shifted the moment I realized there might be 2 children out there." Sophie watched him approaching. He had managed to extract himself from the reporters and now stood a few steps away, looking shaken by the intensity of the press conference. Sophie turned to face him, uncertainty simmering in her eyes. "Did you hear everything?" he asked quietly, wiping perspiration from his brow. She nodded, swallowing against the lump in her throat. "Yes," she said, voice taut with emotion. "I wasn't sure if you'd actually go through with it." He let out a tired breath. "Honestly, neither was I, but think about it." He started to speak again, but she cut him off with a weary gesture. "Ethan, I'm overwhelmed. Please just give me some space." He bowed his head in understanding. "Of course, I'll let you go, but just know I meant what I said. This is about more than business for me." His voice wavered, then firmed. "I'm ready to be their father if you'll let me." Before she could muster a response, he turned and walked away, leaving her alone by the porthole. She closed her eyes. The ship's gentle sway nearly enveloped her. Motherhood. Then she slipped into the hallway to stand alone, thinking about the day's ordeal. The hush felt like a fragile gift, giving her space to breathe and reflect. She noticed Ethan approaching from the opposite end. No reporters in sight this time. He looked as though he wasn't even sure if he should come closer, yet something in her gaze must have drawn him in. He took a tentative step forward, waiting for her to say something. All the questions burning in her mind condensed into, "I don't know yet," he said honestly, "but I want to find out. More importantly, I want to be here for you, both of you, whether I'm your dad or not. I care about you." A quiet settled in the cabin. The children looked to their mother, seeming to read the tension in her posture. Sophie's expression remained guarded, but a flicker of tenderness passed across her face. She gently placed a hand on each twin's shoulder. "I know you have questions," she said. "I do too. but for now he's going to spend some time exchanging laughs and earning tickets for small prizes instead of prying eyes. Some onlookers gave them gentle smiles, as if moved by the notion of a separated family coming together. Sophie felt a hush of gratefulness. It wasn't perfect, but it was calmer than before. When the twins insisted on trying a ring toss game, Ethan knelt beside them, demonstrating how to angle the small rings for the best chance. The younger twin flung a ring that soared off in the wrong direction, prompting giggles. Everyone for making the Family Day event such a success. A handful of cameras from the ship staff captured pictures for the crew's souvenir album. The twins clapped excitedly, asking if they could see their own pictures later. Ethan ruffled the younger boy's hair, smiling in a way Sophie had never seen before, content, proud, and vulnerable all at once. Then, just as the crowd began to disperse, Ethan gently caught Sophie's wrist. Something in his face hinted at a decision made. He cleared his throat, looking publicly declaring he wanted a life with them. She never saw that coming. She knelt beside him, heart pounding, and touched his face softly. "I'm scared, but I'm willing to try," she managed, voice shaky. The twins let out little whoops of excitement, hugging each other and then clinging to their mother's side. The onlookers broke into applause, some snapping pictures, but the moment felt strangely private, as though only the four of them existed. Ethan stood, pulling Sophie into